Let me take this opportunity now to introduce the presenters for today, just by name only. And that's Bob Rhodes from Lives Through Friends, Chris Evans, Butterfly Garden, and Chris Brown, Forest Voluntary Action Forum. And these are great people who've met through another forum who are making the Practice Insights magazine and made a great presentation. I think also participated in the conference 2021. And it's great that when we reach out, that they can share on their article on care in societal, that they were willing to come and join us and share on this important concept. At the end of the day, we can be community development practitioners, but if we are not caring, then we may not go very far. I don't know how to make the presentation for them, but that's a bit I would wish to say. I leave it now to Bob, Chris, and now to lead us through.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I'm going to kick off. Chris, could we get the presentation up? That's brilliant. Thanks, mate. Just to say thank you for inviting us in the first place. We'll introduce ourselves as we go. The way in which we're planning to sort of what's the right word? Conduct this, I guess, is that we're. I'll do a little bit of an introduction from a sort of more of an academic perspective, if you like, although we're not academics, and then we'll in turn give a brief introduction to the work we do. Essentially, what we're doing is we're practitioners. We're sharing our experiences from where we practice, and we're really interested in whether our experience is mirrored in yours. We sort of, in a sense, claim to have a global perspective, but in reality, we know quite a lot about what goes on in Europe. We know quite a lot about what goes on in North America, and we know a little bit about what goes on in Asia, but we have little or no experience of what is happening in Africa, and particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. We, in our different interrelated activities, as you'll hear, are struggling with how we care for and nurture each other sustainably throughout our lives. And suffice it to say that we're concerned that we live in times where it seems that citizens where we live and where we work have been recast in such a way that they're not part of that anymore. They're, you know, it seems to us that citizens have been recast as consumers and as workers, but not necessarily as participants in each other's lives in the same way as maybe it's been throughout history. And we see that as a problem, and we'll start to explain that a little bit. If you can move the screen on, please, Chris. So as I said, what we've been doing is we've been exploring our own experience, and we'll share those as we go. But in the context of then sort of comparing that with what is going on in research and what is going on in creative thinking, if you like. And, you know, just these three quotes here from not very recent ones in many ways. Michael J. Sandel, the public philosopher, of certainly had a big name in the UK 10 years ago, and was in and out of 10 Downing Street talking to our Prime Minister. Wrote a whole book and a whole series of other papers in common with a lot of other people, basically saying, you know, the direction that we went under Mrs. Thatcher and subsequently under Mr. Blair in this country has led to the expansion of markets into areas where they don't belong. And we'll unpick a little bit of that. In our experience as asset-based community development practitioners, you know, we've got the message from John McKnight over and over again, you know, that care is something that can't be bought. It's something, you know, services can supplement, but care is not something that can be bought. And from people like Oliver James, this notion that what's come alongside neoliberalism and what he describes as selfish capitalism, one of the four major characteristics that he describes is that what is being sold to us as individuals within our societies is the notion that every one of our needs can be met through the market, through consumption, through services that or products that meet our every need. So we've got a real problem with that. Chris, can you move on again, please? So in my field, which is, as I'll explain, largely around social services and health services associated with people who have intellectual disabilities, mental health problems, and autism. This statement that I'll read out, but you'll get this afterwards. From Alamansky and Eddie Bartnick. From Eddie Bartnick and Ralph Broad Al wrote the foreword to their latest book. Sort of sums up where we've come from in terms of what he's saying is our social welfare institutions have become undemocratic. They're designed to manage, to ignore natural relationships, to eliminate reciprocity, to restrict eligibility, to enable a few to control the many, to provide order, consistency, and predictability, and to minimize controversy and maximize compliance. They turn beneficiaries into clients. The record shows that institutional decision-making undermines citizen action, ignores community solutions, increases dependency, and preserves resources to maintain out-of-date approaches. And baked into the disability support system are eugenic principles that characterize disabled people than less than human and unworthy of society's scarce resources. And he's suggesting that, and we agree, that we need to shift government's responsibility from producing and financing managerial care to supporting the problem-solving ability of individuals, families, and communities, and removing those barriers to inclusion. Now, I'm going to explain later in my practice that work has been with the most excluded people, and we would argue from a LivesthroughFriends perspective that if we can enable the most excluded, the most negatively described people to become contributing citizens, then that should be achievable for everybody. Okay, Chris. And I'm not going to carry it because this is taking too long, but you can read this stuff later. But what I will draw attention to is what we're seeing, and we've seen it locally in England over the last few days, where as you're probably aware, we've got a relatively new government that's inherited now best part of a 2-decade crisis in what is called social care, on the basis that we've created something that we can't fund. And we've created something that also doesn't meet people's needs in the sense that it doesn't meet people's core psychological needs, because those can't be met, as we'll demonstrate, by services alone. But instead of actually saying, maybe we're doing the wrong things, we need to start again and think from another perspective, and certainly learn from the past as well. People are spending their time critiquing problems in the sense that Fleming puts it, critiquing problems is far easier than imagining credible alternative futures. That seems to be the biggest problem of our political culture today, a colossal failure of imagination. Now, that wasn't said yesterday. David Fleming died in 2012, and he was saying that way before then. And a whole gang of other people have been saying similar things. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing over and over again is an attempt to make something that doesn't work, rather than addressing new solutions and finding out how to make things work and being very, very clear about what our purposes are. Okay, Chris? So we'll be sharing a film at the end, and Anne's in it. Sorry, Anne, we should have told you. We pulled together people that we knew around our world, which is, as I mentioned earlier, a world that's sort of largely focused on Europe, but involves North America and Asia as well. And a gang of 40 people, experts by experience, as well as families, as well as professionals and practitioners and policy people. We pulled those people together in September, and my takeaway from the conclusions that group of people came to, and which we'll show in a film at the end of this presentation, were essentially that, as far as that world is concerned, human services are no longer designed from the standpoint of the end user. Human services systems are not designed to nurture and support strong citizens, families, and communities. But markets and market values have expanded into the way in which we care for each other in a way which has proved cancerous. We seem to have lost the ability to think societally, and basically consumption rather than collaboration dominates the way in which government actually perceives its responsibilities. Another way of putting it is that our politicians have stopped being, if you like, political philosophers, and they've become administrators of systems. What we've also seen in our setting is that the cost of managing the transactions that are involved in managing the market have taken up all the resources that used to be devoted to actually doing the work. So, essentially the role of community workers, the role of community staff, the role of social workers has been either obliterated or redefined in ways which are about managing the market. And that, as I've already mentioned, just setting the scene, the governmental response to that is to, in a very authoritarian way, try and reinforce the thing that doesn't work rather than to come up with new solutions. Thanks, Chris. So as I said, we're going to present, we've all in our own ways and with different agendas been working against that, if you like, that scenario. In my case, I've been in the business for 54 years, I think it is now. Chris is nearly as old as me. That's Chris Evans, who's going to go next, and Chris Brown is the young end of what we do, suggesting that young people actually are perceiving the same things. But anyway, I'm going to hand over to Chris to talk about the butterfly garden, which I just think is an astounding place. And you've got about 12 minutes, Chris.
Thank you. Good morning. So yeah, I'm Chris Evans, and I really feel a bit of a fraud because I crept into this part of the world under the radar, in ignorance. So my backstory is that I am by trade a gardener. I was third generation of a family running a nursery and garden centre business. And as a kid, I fell in love with the whole business of raising plants. I wanted to be out there every hour that I could spare working, and every day, even to this day, I will still rush and check on a crop that I only planted yesterday to see if it's germinated. Into that life 23 years ago, somebody turned up with 6 young children who were autistic, and they said, these kids would like to learn how to garden, can you have a chat with them? And I took them over to my nursery, and I was playing. I'm a bit of a larker, and I was dropping seeds, and I was on the floor with these children giggling, and I knew I wanted to be with them. So I invited them back and said that I would be organised on a second visit and we would do some gardening. The following week they turned up, and the day after the school phoned and said, it's a bit embarrassing, those kids have come back really fired up, can you take some more? And in week 3 I took 23 young people with an assortment of issues that they were dealing with, and I had them gardening, and I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. It was my first experience, but what I realized that I was working with people. There was nothing complicated about it. They were different to some of the other people I'd worked with, but they were excited, and that was at the heart of my journey with them initially. And within a week, people were phoning and saying, I've been hearing about your project, could I bring somebody? And then I had somebody turn up with a couple of chaps who had mental health issues, and they said, could they join in? And I was slightly thrown, but I said, oh, it's fine. I mean, I'm only doing 1 day a week, so come and join in. But they couldn't do the day I was offering. They could do the next day, so I said that would be fair enough. And I had to pretend that I'd still got a regular job, and in fact my focus was switching. And when I worked with those guys for a very short period of time, one of them cried and said that why was I being so trusting, that they'd been in a situation where they'd been institutionalized and they were unused to getting friendship. They were unused to somebody saying, help yourself to a cup of tea. And I knew then that I would never be able to say no again, because here there were more people. They were real people. They had real stories. And I threw up a canopy which suggested the people I was working with had journeys that were compromised. And that actually, if we're all honest, all of our journeys are compromised. And if we look in our bag, we'll find a bit of rubbish that'll mess up the day. I have a friend who's terrified of mice. He wouldn't see himself on any kind of list, but he would stand on a chair, even at 70 years of age, if a mouse came into the room, and you'd not shift him until the mouse had gone. So people with compromised journeys were telling other people with compromised journeys, and we gardened. But as I watched, I realised those people didn't actually want to garden. Quite a number were looking for further distraction. They wanted to be part of something, but not necessarily to garden. They were happy standing in the garden chatting. So I said, okay, you guys can be tidying up, and they're tidying up. And I said, we could do some recycling. We'll do some recycling. So they started recycling, and then I realized I needed licenses to legitimately recycle. And so I got licenses, which was a big mistake because everybody assumed I was a recycling facility. And then people were turning up saying, look, I've just retired. Could I come and help? And then others were getting in touch. And I had communication from social services and all sorts of agencies saying, so what are the rules? I mean, could I ask you about the rules? And I said, there are no rules, really. I mean, I'm out here, and if people want to come and join, I'm pleased for them to come. And if they don't want to be here, they don't have to be. And I'm not chasing targets, and it's not about profiteering, and it's free. And I'm enjoying myself, and that's a big deal for me. But we created a very buzzy community in no time of 50 or so people. And so somebody said, well, you're really going to need a dedicated building. So I started digging a hole, and somebody said, what's that about? And I said, it's going to be a building. And how are you going to fund it? And I said, I don't know, but I see the need. So the next day I found £10,000 had been left in my shop, and this is for your building. And then people randomly were turning up and saying, well, could I give you a £5? Could I give you £10? Could I give you £15? And in parallel to all of this, the phone kept ringing. People saying, I've just finished at college and I don't know what I'm going to do, and could I come? And the range of people that were coming became more and more diverse. So I have connection with people with everything. On the journey of the compromised, so I have people who are having a bad day. I've had people who've been made redundant who don't know what to do with their lives anymore and are at high risk of crashing. And I have people with life-threatening conditions, and people who are just having a struggle in so many different ways, mobility issues, life-threatening illness. And those people will turn up, and I don't know who's coming. So I will say to you that when this meeting concludes, I will go out onto the site, and somebody will say, what's the plan for today? And I don't do plans. As a gardener, I learned to expect the unexpected. When I thought I'd mastered the job, I knew I hadn't, but I knew by the end of the day I would find joy in it. And the same is applying to this project. So what happened really was that the skills that I was developing as a gardener were totally transferable. That actually, when you plant something and it grows, it's full of surprises. And I think the thing that's been most disarming about the experience is the fact that on a daily basis, people will take responsibility. They will come up with ideas, and they know I will say yes. And ideas that are sometimes completely crazy, but we must never say no. It's probably the greatest criticism on the site is I say yes to everything, and there is no exaggeration in that. It's true. And so today we've got £500,000 worth of buildings. I don't know how we paid for them. I've got 6 acres of ground, and I don't really quite understand that either. I'm seeing in excess of 300 people a week, And most days we'll see at least 60. And the platform that was initially about a few kids gardening now attracts people of every age, right through well past retirement. And on a daily basis, we will deliver art and music and dance, and we'll deliver craft and drama and cookery and recycling. And occasionally we'll do some gardening. And on every day, there will be the element that was never expected. The world is full of people. They need to find the confidence to hold hands. When you look to your left and to your right, there should be no different. Everybody has something inside that they are keen to give. They are keen to share. They just require the permission, and they require the confidence that will come when that permission is consistent in its delivery. So on a daily basis, I will say to people, we'll do this and we'll do that, and we will. On a daily basis, I will say to people, let's be doing this. This was your idea. Just before Christmas, the police turned up here. They said, we've got some stuff we're throwing away, and somebody suggested that you're not any good at saying no. And so we wondered whether you'd like these. And I said, what are they? And he said they are defunct riot shields. Police riot shields, and I took on 30 of them, and we turned them into Christmas baubles and hung them up in trees. And everybody stood back and said, what's next? But by the next day, there was the next. And so it rolls on. So today I know will be an adventure. Today will be exciting. Today there is no plan. Today I don't know who's coming. It doesn't matter, because they're people and they deserve a go. And what amuses me greatly, I mean, I'm delighted to be part of this forum this morning, but what amuses me greatly is that I think I've been doing what was totally natural to me and what I assumed would be common sense to the world. And nobody has ever been charged in 23 years, and people come and people trust and people involve themselves. And I can't wait to be out there in an hour's time. Thank you. I hope that covers my slot. I've been watching the clock very carefully. As you will have gathered, I can talk for England.
Thanks, Chris.
Inviting me.
Would you like just to say the thing that strikes me always about the butterfly garden is its relationship with money and its relationship with commissioners and relationship with regulation. Would you like just to say 30 seconds about that?
Yeah, of course. Well, I didn't know anything about those things. So when people would, I mean, it's nonsense, really. There's a great platform of hypocrisy. The system knows it's wrong. So I'll get somebody turn up and they say, I'm from social services. Can you tell me what your health and safety policy is? And I said, well, the health and safety policy really is me. And I walk around, and he said, have you got a written document? And I said, no. And he said, well, of course you should have. And I said, well, I shouldn't. I mean, giving people the opportunity to come and join me. I said, I've put in place insurance, but if we spend our lives wrapping the world in cotton wool, the day we forget, people will die. So I monitor, and I encourage others to monitor. And the students that are here, I don't do disabled. I have students, and we're all students, volunteer or whatever you are when you come to students. So he said, well, so you don't have that policy? No. What do you do about safeguarding? I said, well, I try to look after people, and I encourage people to respect one another and look after them. And because of that trust in those that come, people will report to me, and people will come and say, I'm not happy about Fred, he's not very well, or whatever. People will phone me and say, can I have a chat with you about this or that? And this man said, well, so you don't do that and you don't do that. And what about proven outcome? I mean, do you have anything lined up in that area? And I said, no, I don't really. I don't need to prove anything. I'm giving the opportunity for people to create community, to share space on their own terms. If they're having a rubbish day, I don't want them knowing that if they're not here by 9 o'clock, they can't be here. Oh, he said, so you don't really apply any of the rules? And I said, no. He said, well, I've got this chap. Is it okay if he still comes? Every single agency that is out there, from social services right the way through local authorities, mental health services, individual doctors, all of them on a daily basis are referring people to me to look at my non-existent paperwork. It's not meant to sound clever. It was just born out of a willingness to share my life and enjoy the time of sharing other people's lives. And it's a joy. I can't believe my luck, really. I'm never more than a millimetre from a smile. On any day, never more than a millimetre from the smile.
That's brilliant, Chris. Thanks ever so much. Time is passing, so
yeah, I noticed.
Thanks, Chris, and I'm gonna ask Chris Brown to take over. And as I say, we'll all introduce ourselves. So I shan't attempt to introduce Chris.
Brilliant, thank you, Bob. Yeah, so I'm the Chief Executive Officer of a charity called Forest Voluntary Action Forum. And I think I know, like most other community development workers, I wear many, many hats, including as a director of LivesthroughFriends, as a town councillor, as an events organiser, and many, many, many other things. I think that can be part and parcel of the work that we do, and I'm lucky to be able to do so. So how do we get here? Bob has touched on a lot of this already, but I think it's always nice to recap and remember. So community approaches to social care have been in steep decline for a while now. Arguably before, but I think the thing that a lot of people look to is the Thatcher era within the UK anyway. And that classic quote, "There's no such thing as society. We are but individuals, and we must look after ourselves before we look after others." And that philosophy and that introduction of the market began systemic dismantling of the welfare state and the social care, community social care system as we knew it. And whilst I think many of us looked to hope from different perspectives of government, and I know that's the case now to a degree with now a Labour government within the UK, we also had the same assumption in the 90s with the Labour government under New Labour. And whilst there were obviously improvements, they did largely reinforce, as did successive governments after them, that idea that services were there to be consumed. They weren't reciprocal, and actually services were to do more in people's lives than they traditionally were meant to ever do anyway. And I think that impact is snowballed again and again and again for every government that's followed. And as an organisation, so we're what we call a CVS, that's a Council for Voluntary Service. And those were disbanded by the Conservative government when they came in 2010. And with that came a huge underinvestment in community infrastructure. Now, as we've reduced more marketisation, and as Chris talked so well about bureaucracy, it's become increasingly hard for community activism to take place, for charities and voluntary sector organisations to act truly on behalf of communities rather than on behalf of commissioners. And what we've seen as a result in the voluntary and community sector, certainly in the UK, is that capitalistic approach to charity. So, which is so often driven by competition rather than in collaboration. And the result of that, unfortunately, is we've now got a handful of what we call sort of mega charities, humongous charities, empires of charities that dominate the sector, dominate resources, and unfortunately dominate the influence of governments and the like. We've also had initiatives that have been introduced over the years, including social prescribing, which I'm sure a number of you will be aware of, came in 2018. I'll be telling you a story about social prescribing shortly. But ultimately, what we have seen as a result of this philosophy is a generational change in communities. So I'm going to talk to you about the community that I come from. So I live and represent a district called the Forest of Dean. We're right on the periphery of the county, the country, and largely have been left to be independent, interdependent from government. And whilst that sounds somewhat depressing, people who live in the Forest of Dean traditionally talk about the area, quite rightly so, in very positive terms. We talk about, I'm looking at the bottom there, we talk about how we're resilient and resourceful. We talk about how much pride we've got in the place that we live. We talk about our rich heritage and our culture. We talk about how we are connected to nature, the local enterprise, traditional communities, how we're independent and how we have warm hospitality, which was completely evident during the COVID era. Unfortunately, what we've got now is a huge void in between the way in which citizens talk about the place that they live in the Forest of Dean and the way institutions talk about Forest of Dean. So the way institutions will refer to the area in which I live will often be in a deficit basis. So they'll talk around, oh, it's got high levels of deprivation. There's low educational attainment. They've got low aspiration. They're isolated. They lack diversity. They have lower than average life expectancy, low economic output, and even backwards or behind the times. Now, unfortunately, we fall into the trap of feeling like funding and resources are the answer to all of our issues, and they are to some. The challenge we've got is that funding and those resources are held by services and those that use and reiterate the latter language in which I was speaking to just now. And unfortunately, those resources are distributed on the basis of those deficits rather than those positives and the opportunities in which people see and understand in their community. And that creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of learned helplessness and learned hopelessness that erodes how some citizens see the way in which they live. And that's very much what brought me to community development. So growing up in the Forest of Dean, I heard tales from my parents and my grandparents of how, always been relatively poor, but rich in social capital. So when there is a need to build a local hospital, they just got on and they did it between themselves. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't wait for government. They did it themselves. When they needed a local school, they did it themselves. When they needed a leisure centre, when they needed a swimming pool, they went out, they fundraised, and they did it themselves. And contrast that to when I was working in that very same community 30, 40 years later. And those people living in those same houses were coming into the children's centre in which I worked and were qualifying for every single professional how all the challenges they had in their lives, how much they were struggling, all the deficits, all the reason why they couldn't do anything for themselves and other people in order to get support. And that just highlighted to me how wrong we've got society. So that comes into Forest Voluntary Action Forum. So I joined Forest Voluntary Action Forum 8 years ago, 8.5 years ago. It was actually established in 1994. And it's established by a consortium of community leaders with the purpose to support volunteering and community action in the Forest of Dean. And that was largely through providing infrastructure functions that are necessary for communities to navigate this world of bureaucracy that I just talked about. So I fundamentally believe that relationships are the work. So there's a few quotes that you may have seen already, but now, on average, social workers spend 80% of their time doing admin and only 20% of their time with real families. And I think this is a real powerful quote from a social worker as well. So social workers becoming more focused on figures and statistics, pressure is put on staff to ensure paper is completed, and in turn, this results in less time working with families. You never have time to write things up. Now, I believe that we can't support communities if we don't understand, if we don't know them, and we're not trusted. We once valued social workers, teachers, doctors that were rooted in their community. Everybody knew their local doctor, and their local doctor knew everybody. The same with the teachers, the same with their social workers. Now, what was a huge advantage then is now seen as a threat. So when I was working in a school before I was at VAF, it was seen as a real negative that I lived in the place that I worked, because that was seen as a threat. That was seen as a threat to my safety, to my objectivity. So when I joined the VAF, every hour of my day was spent trying to understand what mattered to real people. And relationship building became the integral and intentional part of my work. We also went out and we built relationships with local government, with commissioners, funders, etc., in order to identify possible synergy for communities and institutions to work effectively and fairly and equitably together. And even now that we're a larger organisation, I still spend easily 70% of my time building intentional relationships with people. And crucially, I'm really proud to say so, we employ people in my organisation that live and work in the communities in which they serve, and we provide paid time for them to go out and volunteer and contribute to those communities in every way that they can. And that might be as a trustee or helping an organisation with fundraising, you name it. So I'll give you a couple of very, very brief stories now because I'm wary of time. So we ran a community cafe before COVID, and we're just about to relaunch in a different location. But there was one interaction with a social worker and the person they were working with that really brought home the difference in the way in which we work. So a social worker came into our community cafe with what they referred to as a client, or Sarah, is every other person in the world calls her. The social worker goes on with Sarah next to her and tells us everything that's wrong with Sarah, all the things that are wrong in her life. She's lonely. She never goes out except to Wetherspoons. And now she's banned from Wetherspoons because she never buys anything from Wetherspoons. So I'm not going to go into all the disabilities and health and stuff like that they did, but we didn't care about any of that at all. We didn't care about any of it. All we cared about is understanding what mattered to Sarah. And believe it or not, those things didn't matter to Sarah. What mattered to Sarah is being around people and crafting. She loved craft. She loved making things. So we said, come in whenever you want. Take as much space as you want. You don't need to spend anything. Just be. So she came in. She came in most days. She bought her own lunch. We then found additional funding. We collected donations, so she had more craft materials to extend the great stuff that she did. And, you know, as happens when you're in a fantastic community space, others began to take an interest in what was going on. It then, more people became introduced, and it turned into a group. So now Sarah, who was once, so say, lonely and isolated, is now running a craft group, something she never thought she would do. Not only that, they started selling their creations through the cafe, so making some money to make what she was doing sustainable. She then began to buy food and drink from the cafe because she wanted to contribute. She wanted to give back to something that had supported her. We helped Sarah to attend events. She began to sell the things that she did, and she now runs a really successful online business. Now, that's a long way from the person that was introduced to us by that social worker. And I'll tell you another story again briefly. So I mentioned social prescribing was introduced in 2018, and there are some really positive aspects of social prescribing. Social prescribing is a recognition of the role that community plays in people's lives. Through giving people connection, they improve their health and well-being. However, the way in which that relationship became so attached to a service and a referral-based system meant that people were now increasingly becoming referred to community activity. And as a result, community activity became treated like a service. So what you'll see here is a lunch club that has been in Cinderford for a place in the Forest of Dean that I live for over 30 years. And it's always been really successful. And the volunteer that ran it came to me and said, oh, we're really struggling. We're really struggling with the lunch club. We think we'll have to close it. And I was like, oh gosh, I'll come along and see what's going on. And I was expecting to see, 3 or 4 people there. No, there's 50 people there. There's 50 people there at this lunch club that's so struggling. So I come and I say, how on earth are they struggling? So I sat back and I observed, and what I could see was one volunteer and 49 people that were just taken. And those people were there, they weren't contributing in any way at all. They would sit down and they were clicking their fingers at the volunteer to bring them their meals and bring them their raffle tickets. They weren't baking the cakes, they weren't cleaning up after themselves, they weren't putting the chairs back, they weren't helping to set up the room or put it away. There were people there that had entirely been referred to by services and were therefore treating it as a service in which they can consume. And as a result, that lunch club closed. And that's just one example of what happens when we treat communities like services. Now, Bob, I've also put a stopwatch on and I've talked for 15 minutes already. So I'm going to very, very quickly in 30 seconds in for these slides. So in summary, what we do as an organisation is we work really hard to take bureaucracy out of community action. Sometimes we can't take it out, but we navigate it. And we try and do the things that people don't care about to enable them to do the things that they care about. This is saying I'm really believing the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. And much of our time we spend building alliances to break down competition, instead bring people together to enable them to do the things that matter to them, rather than worrying about who might come in and take their important piece of work. So lots around alliance building, and the most prominent one of those is the Forestine Youth Association. And when we created the Forestine Youth Association, of which Bob was a co-founder, of 50+ organisations, it was with the intention of changing the way in which youth provision was delivered in communities. And that resulted in a massive partnership that has gone on to be the first of its kind, the first partnership of only locally rooted organisations to deliver significant commissioned contracts. So we now have the contract for the children and family centres in the Forestine and the youth support services. And we did it in a way that broke down competition. We brought everyone together, one united bid that utilises the strengths and opportunities of every single one of them in the communities that they represent. And yeah, that's really exciting. And we've also utilised that approach in bringing back community assets. So community assets and buildings that were once belonged to the state or were once taken by the state from communities, we have brought back in many different guises as community centres, community hubs, cafes, you name it, hospices. And as a result, we've now got an organisation 8.5 years down the line where we employ over 30 staff. We have over 1,000 active volunteers. We've been cited in national and international research. And importantly, we've gone from having a clearly apathetic community that I spoke to you about earlier to one that is resilient and well connected. And I won't speak to this, but I think, and you'll get this, but I think we all need to reflect on what we can do in our various roles to promote community development within our various work. Okay, Bob, we're at 17 minutes. There you are. Apologies.
Right, so I'm Bob Rhodes. As I said earlier, I've been in what you might describe as the community development human services arena for more than half a century. What I'm going to talk about largely is LivesthroughFriends, and that for me is a retirement project, I guess, that results from the work that I did throughout my career, which was very largely focused for much of the last 30 years. I was in a proper job, closing long-stay institutions and creating community services around people with learning disabilities and intellectual and autism. And I'll use the term intellectual disabilities as well, because some parts of the world don't use the term learning disability. And in particular, around people who has acquired what loosely might be called very challenging reputations, people who were in secure environments, largely as a result of the way in which society had progressed them through services that didn't meet their needs and didn't work. I think the other side of me, which is on the other side of that screen, is the bit that was started off my career in youth and community work before I found myself in social work and running disability services in the centre of Birmingham. And then from that, finding myself working in places like Pakistan and Greece and other places where you're working a totally different cultural environment, a totally different resource environment, and learning that there are many, many ways of, as we would say in English, skinning a cat or solving problems. The other thing that's on that screen is a reference to something I was involved with in the 80s, which was probably most people here won't know that social services departments were only established in England and Wales and Scotland, I guess, in the early 1970s. And by the 80s, we were reviewing how well we were going. And if you can move the screen on, please, Chris. And there were a number of reports, Seabohm in 78, I think it was, but the one I'm going to refer to was a report by the Berkeley Committee to Government in 1982. And the reports that Berkeley produced, or the Berkeley Committee produced, and I certainly was a contributor to, basically said, we've looked at all the different approaches to how we might care for each other throughout our lives within our communities, and we've come to the conclusion that the community approach is the best way. You know, there will never be enough resource to replace what people do for each other in a well-ordered society. But more importantly, we'd learned that services can't do those things that are about reciprocal relationship, that are about creating contribution, all those sorts of things, in the way in which we do in our mainstream relationships. That was the report that went to government, and it was the report that was totally and utterly rejected by Mrs. Thatcher. And you know, her point of view was very straightforward. You know, as I said in my introduction, her point of view was job of government is to ensure that there are services that meet people's needs, and the best way of providing those services is by basically developing a competitive marketplace. And we know now, what, 40 years on, we know it doesn't work. Except we don't know how to admit that it doesn't work. So if we move on, please, Chris. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about our experience. When I was running an organisation called TAT UK, which arose out of the leading role we took in developing services that actually worked for people who'd acquired very challenging reputations, who were coming out of long-stay institutions. The starting point for me was when I was in social services in the Midlands, starting to pull people back out of large institutions. Thousands of people lived in large institutions. But the real turning point for me was when the major national scandal in England happened at Borough Court. It was called The Silent Minority. A TV company got in and exposed what was going on. Because we were already involved in the work, I ended up being asked to be part of the group reporting to the minister about what should happen, and then got asked to implement our report. And what we learned very, very quickly was that what we knew didn't work. And what we decided to do was to start working one person at a time, working out what the best life possible was for that individual, and then working out how to get there. We did that with hundreds of people over time, but I'm going to tell you 3 stories. And the first concerns Ray. Ray Cox. Ray's no longer with us. He died some years ago. But before he died, he asked us to help him make a film about his life, and that's what's shown on the screen. Ray was one of those people who these days probably we would have described as having autism. But back in the 70s and 80s, we weren't that, you know, we really hadn't worked that stuff out. And Ray had spent his life between mental health institutions, the old psychiatric hospitals, and what were then called the mental handicap hospitals, which were basically established originally to take people with learning disabilities out of the community completely. And Ray had spent all of his life, by the time we got to know him, he was in his late 50s, early 60s, but he spent all of his life since he was 14 years old in institutional, inverted commas, care. Ray was somebody whose response to the world was self-injurious. He did horrible things to himself, and of all the people we worked with closing Borough Court, he was the person who you would say the vast majority of staff that we work with were least comfortable working with, because Ray would seriously hurt himself. He would in quite disgusting ways, I guess. People would be disgusted by what he was doing, and he would make himself excluded by cause of that completely. And his life experience was one of custodial care, effectively. We got Ray out of the institution. We designed a service for him where he lived with two other people, two ladies who had other needs, but different needs to him. And we worked through the process of enabling Ray to have trust, to have a role in life. And over time, it was hell on earth for a period of time. He would blockade himself in rooms and continue to self-injure. We were having to break in. We were having to call the police. But what we didn't do was walk away from him. And we got to a point after a couple of years where his talent started to come out, and he'd be inviting us to go and have Sunday lunch with him, and he'd have cooked it. He was starting to relate to his neighbours, and his neighbours were very elderly, and he looked after their garden. There was a whole gang of stuff going on, and then Ray had a fall. He broke his hip, and he was admitted to the local general hospital. And unusually these days, he had the operation pretty immediately, and then his life fell apart again because the system got hold of him. As a social worker decided that he couldn't go back to his own home because his bedroom was upstairs and the toilets were upstairs and so on. And she decided that he should go to an old people's home, to which we objected as his carers, and his friends objected to as well, but nobody was listened to. In fact, the people he lived with basically said, we'll go up the living room, it can be converted into his bedroom, we can build a shower room and toilet for him into that facility. We were prepared to do that, but still we weren't listened to. And Ray found himself in an old people's home where from which he was ejected after less than 36 hours because he didn't want to be there, and the behaviours that had presented throughout his life reoccurred. So he was then moved. Again, the system's response was not to listen to what worked and to recognise that his life had been good, and that people actually knew how to support him. But the next move was to move him as an emergency from there into the psychiatric hospital, somewhere where he'd had really negative experiences, and where immediately, of course, he acted out and he was put in a side room, but nobody emptied his pockets, so he set fire to it. And the consequence of that was, of course, that he was placed in more custodial situations, eventually placed in a very, very inappropriate service where there were staff that he knew that had bullied him and treated him badly in the past, where Ray decided he was going to die. And he set about doing it. And at that point, the person who had been the support manager for the service that Ray had lived in when he went through the hardest times coming out of the institution appeared. She had stayed in touch. She'd left. She'd gone off to have a family. She lived in Wales, and she basically took Ray out of that institutional setting and took him into her own home, where immediately his issues reduced. And at that point, politically, things were getting very, very difficult for that public authority, and we were asked to provide for him again. And the long and the short of this story is that we helped Ray find his own home. We helped him re-establish a support team of people that he knew and trusted, and he lived in his own home, which was a very nice home, which he couldn't have otherwise have achieved, by the river in Reading for the rest of his life. Now, the issue here is again about the system only knows how to do what it does rather than knowing how to solve problems and how to work with community. And that's about how things are established. Can you move it on, please, Chris? Similarly, and probably this is as far as I'm going to go with stories, I've got others, but Joe Powell is somebody who you can check out on the internet. Joe tells his own story. He does it with me quite often. And Joe is somebody who has at one point been a trustee and director of LivesthroughFriends as well. Joe is somebody on the spectrum. He has autism, and in his teens, he went through a particularly bad time that was misdiagnosed. He ended up in institutional care. He spent 11 years in institutional care, most of which he spent a long way away from his funding authority. He was born in the northeast of England, grew up in Gateshead. He ended up living in South Wales with a specialist autism provider. But again, institutional rules and systems intervened in his life. Essentially, Gateshead local authority didn't visit him for 5 years. And Joe, during the period he was placed in a very inappropriate institutional setting where he was the only person of normal intelligence, shall we say. He's the only person that had not only autism, but an intellectual disability as well. Joe basically sorted himself out over time and matured. But his commissioners didn't know it because they weren't visiting and nobody was in contact with him. And the care provider was being paid a large amount of money. And they were basically just saying things are going very well in their reports. Joe managed to get representation from an advocate who contacted his authority. It just so happened that we at LivesthroughFriends were working with his authority and 12 other authorities in that region at the time on specific issues, and they knew that I didn't live too far away from Joe, and they asked me to go and check it out and meet him. The process that we went through at that point was what we do with everything, and I'll explain that very shortly. But what we did was I set about helping Joe identify the life he wanted to lead. And then we started thinking about how we could progress that. And whilst that was going on and we were developing that plan, and the local authority that were funding him were supporting us in doing that, the specialist provider was basically telling him that if he progressed in the direction things were going, he would spend his life in a psychiatric hospital. So Joe was prevaricating as to going forward. The turning point for Joe was the point at which he basically, in frustration, exclaimed to me that his real objective in life was to pay tax, which is not something that most of us scream about, is it? And the consequence of that was that we were able to sit down and work out the steps that would need to be taken, amongst which, as you can see in the photograph, was Joe's decision that he needed to have the education that he'd missed out on during the time when he was going through his breakdown. The consequence for Joe has been, instead of continuing to spend his life in an institution costing about £180,000 a year, he now pays tax. He lives in his own home. He actually owns his own home now. He has a mortgage and owns his own home. And he's chief executive of the organisation that organises and supports self-advocacy for people with intellectual disabilities in Wales. And Joe's story is just a primary example of if you start working with the assets and you start working towards what the real purpose of care should be, as to what can happen. Right, Chris, can you move it on? I'm going to flash over that because I'm running out of time and we need to show the film. So if we can carry on. Just to say, when you get this this presentation sent through to you, What we've produced over time, and it continues to evolve, is a how to do it framework. It is not a model, because of everybody is different and every circumstance is different and every community is different, every family is different. But over time, what we've learned is that if we ask people how they want to live, we identify the purpose that we're pursuing. So we're not going to set up a plan immediately. We're not going to set up a process immediately that achieves that, but we're setting out on a journey to achieve that direction of travel, and we're doing it with everybody that's involved. And we've worked out as well that families and communities have got to be at the centre of that work as equal partners with us as professionals. You know, the principle we use behind that is the thing that was spelt out by Al Mansky in A Good Life. I don't know if you've read his book, but where he basically says the purpose of public services should be to supplement and complement the strengths of communities and the strengths of families and the strengths of citizens. Central to the work we do, because of a lot of the people we work with are isolated, is about building reciprocal relationships and helping people be part of people's lives. And part of that, of course, is enabling people to contribute to and be part of the communities in which they live. So there's a whole different skill base to the one that's normally associated with care. And part of that key skill base is this ability. You know, we do a lot of training around helping people to think creatively, to solve problems, to create possibilities and opportunities. A lot of the work we do, of course, as I've mentioned, is around people who present with very difficult behaviours. And what we've established over time, working with Dr. Andy McDonnell and others at Studio 3 and with a range of other people, is that, you know, essentially the way forward is taking stress out of those situations for the person and also for the people that are involved in their lives. And we've learned a lot about how to do that. So, you know, as I say, we're on a journey. This isn't about the money. Leadership is crucial to this stuff. Tenacity is crucial. And I guess what the reason we do these sorts of workshops and seminars is because of what is behind everything that we've learned is the necessity to start to build and sustain systems that allow this sort of work to happen, rather than the negative stuff that currently goes on. Okay, Chris? So what we're going to do now, before we share our details with you, is just to show a film of the event that we held in Cheltenham back in September, where we pulled together a gang of people with the question, essentially, that we were begging, which was the current narrative, the neoliberal, competition-based, market-based narrative in how we produce public services is basically collapsing. What is the alternative narrative that we should be working towards? And do you want to show that now, Chris?
The Lives Through Friends Summer Institute in September 2024 brought together experts from around the globe, experts by experience and experts in allyship, to discuss the shortcomings of current care systems and explore alternative approaches.
Cheltenham Summer Institute is an opportunity to bring people together from all walks of service, all walks of life. So families come, people who work in systems come, people who work for systems come, and we get a chance to spend time together exploring ideas, thinking about what small incremental changes can we make.
I was here last year and it blew my mind, I think, because the place itself is so amazing. So the place itself is the Butterfly Garden, and it is a really good demonstration of what happens when the system gets out of the way and lets people do what people are good at, which is connecting and contributing to something bigger.
This is the second time I've been to this event. We first got in touch with Lives Through Friends because we're trying to bring people back from out of area. We had nowhere for them, no services for them, and we're trying to figure out how to change the system and make ways to provide a service that we've never had before.
What's really lovely is just to not only to share the ideas amongst each other, share those common themes, be a support for each other, I guess, in that sense. And I think just also an opportunity to learn and inspire each other.
There are people here from all over the world they've wrestled with the same problems, or they are wrestling with the same problems. Some of them have found some solutions, some really good solutions. Some things that we perhaps wouldn't have tried here. There are parent groups who have found a way to work and change the system completely because there was no system for them to work within. If they can create something from nothing, I would hope that we can work within the system to create something that is better.
We say that the group is much bigger than its parts. So when we all come together in this space, we have a power through this sharing and learning from each other to feed back our practices and create a difference and get this thing forward. Maybe in a global level, not only in our national small realities. And it's always nice to reflect and learn from each other.
And I guess we want to share our personal experiences of people who have been, I suppose, limited by the system and the barriers, who continue to campaign as self-advocates to change those barriers or remove those barriers. And again, hopefully to inspire other people as well. Again, by our stories about what can be changed, what can happen. But I think also to contribute to a wider conversation we're all having about how we can all best understand, is there a way we can do things better? And I think everybody's pretty much concluded there is. There is a better way. And how do we get the world to start to see that?
It's been really great having people from different cultures, from different countries, from different systems coming together to share their thoughts and their ideas. Although we come from different places, we all share a common purpose, and actually we all share a commonality of the challenges and the issues that we're facing. But actually with different lenses, it creates you the opportunity to have different perspectives.
One of the challenges of systems is that eventually over time, systems get very reliant on the way they operate, and so they become very rigid. And people who are being served in systems are not. They have lives that are fluid, they have lives that change, they have lives that have different needs. And one of the challenges within systems, and one of the things we're talking about here, is how do we work together to create some kind of flexibility?
The services, the care system has taken over, and people unlearned to be caring and giving the normal care they should, and they're still capable of, and in a way are still willing. But as McKnight also says, people get the idea that for the people with learning disabilities, for instance, they're being cared for, so they don't need us as a community. And I think what is very important to get the community back into realizing that they are very much needed, and that what as a community, as fellow citizens, as neighbors, we can offer something services never can offer.
If you want to look at a system from a human point of view, in a sense from the right point of view, the first question is, have we really understood what matters to these people in their terms, not in our terms? We must take away our lens, our functional specialist lens, and judge whether what we do is right for them, and understand the world from their point of view, and then bring the resources from around them, in the family, in the community, from voluntary, state provision, whatever it is, proportionate to their definition of what good looks like in terms of living a life or having a death, either way. Now, the interesting thing about that is that it's better for everybody, but not only better for the person who's receiving the care, it's better for strengthening their communities, it's better for the social worker or helper who is involved, because that's their vocation, as it were. It's also better for society, because that happening is not only doing a good job of looking after people in communities, it's also a hell of a lot cheaper.
It's about thinking about what we can all do differently as individuals to contribute to change. But ultimately, change is needed because such extreme inequalities in the life experiences and opportunities between a person with a learning disability, an autistic person, and those of us who do not have a learning disability or are not autistic, the differences in life opportunities are not justifiable, they're not acceptable.
We need to find the confidence to say, if we've got creative people, we've got to give them the license to come up with ideas.
We're the sum of the resources that we have. We're a very powerful network of people, and we take advantage of the social capital. And this is much richer than concluding on the funding or the services that we provide, you know. So I think this approach is really enriching the bureaucratic way of just, you know, being a service provider.
When you get access to something and you make it grow and it thrives, there's success in the simplicity of that journey and success in the complexity of that journey.
During the 3 days of stimulating seminars, exchanges and conversations, the working group, from their collective input and experience, and facilitated by LivesthroughFriends, Plan and Vanguard, drafted a communiqué as a global expression of their shared concerns and aspirations for the world of social care. Here's an extract from the communiqué. We envision a world where care for individuals with intellectual disabilities and autism is rooted in human connection, interdependence, and kindness. This can be achieved through an intelligent combination of person-centered, locally designed services and the fostering of resilient, caring social networks. To find out more and to join our movement for change, visit our website, LivesthroughFriends.org.
Thanks. You put up the last slide, Chris.
Sorry, it was stuck on the video, so I had to escape.
Which is just the contact details. I was just going to say that if anybody wants to have a look at the full communique that came from the participants in Cheltenham, it's on our website. It's on LivesthroughFriends.org. On the yeah, when you get your copy of this presentation, all of our contact details are on the end of it. But I guess we've got 5 or 10 minutes to take questions if people want to ask questions or make observations. I guess, Daniel, if you could chair this bit, then we'll respond if people want us to.
Thanks, Bob Rhodes, Chris Evans, and Chris Brown. Quite an inspiring presentation. And colleagues, can you give this team a round of applause?
Thank you.
A great way to start the year, being reminded that our journeys have been interrupted by institutionalization of many of the things that matter to us in our lives. And yet we have to now go back and find our voice, exercise our citizenship, and be able to take charge of the destinies of those we are connected with. The floor is open for comments, questions. Looks people are so happy. I'm not seeing anybody with a question or comment.
Fine. Well, in conclusion, just to say the Summer Institute will happen again in 2025. We'd welcome participation from anybody that wants to come. And it may well happen in 2 or 3 different locations around the world this year, the way in which things are unfolding. An invitation to Sub-Saharan Africa would always be welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much, and we'll remain in touch. And once we have the finalized details, just share with us, and then we'll share in our network, and then we can see how we can be part of this great move to counter neoliberalism and the dehumanization of who we are by institutions and by government systems who say there are no resources, but they have resources to support institutions which do not really do and reach to and appeal to the passions and take care of the needs or fulfill our rights as human beings. Okay. So by way of next steps, we are done with January, and thanks so much again, Bob, Chris, and Chris. In February, we are having a topic on social inclusion, stories of change. And March, we'll be having a topic on community development and housing rights, focusing more on informal housing. And then April, we'll have a discussion led by students. It's a community development students forum, and they can give us insights on what really matters and what is important from their perspective in terms of what community development as a discipline and a practice should really prioritize. And so this presentation and this session is recorded. We'll be able to post the recording when it is fully processed on our website, and also we'll also share with those participants who have registered in the addresses that have already been captured, and equally also the presentation. Kindly, Bob and Chris, we hope you can allow us also to share it with the participants. Okay, thank you so much for your kindness. And so we'll continue the engagement, we'll continue the connection. Thank you so much for creating time to be with us, and enjoy your day, enjoy the year as it starts. Be blessed.